Well, good afternoon and welcome again on this Thursday afternoon, this beautiful day, to our Convocation. We look forward to a wonderful conversation today as we gather every Thursday afternoon. For those of you who are in the room, thank you for being here in person. For those of you who are online, we are grateful for your presence as well. And a special shout out to Daniel Cummings. Daniel comes over about 45 minutes early every week, sets up the room, and makes sure all the hymnals are out. So Daniel, thanks to you for all that you do. We are so very, very grateful. Our topic for today is going to relate to matters of the environment and climate. And so we've chosen for our hymn number 14, For the Beauty of the Earth. Thank you, Judy, for playing for us again this afternoon. Our scripture comes from Psalm 19, and you'll hear echoes in this psalm of what we've just sung about. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims God's handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard. Yet, their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In the heaven, God set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom from his wedding canopy, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them. Nothing is hid from its heat. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is clear, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the drippings of the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is your servant warned, keeping them there is great reward. But who can detect their errors? Clear us, O God, from our hidden faults, and keep back your servants from the sin of insolent pride. Do not let them have dominion over us. Then we shall be blameless and innocent of great transgression. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Let us pray. God, the wisdom of the psalmist tells us to listen. Not only to listen to the text of the scriptures, the law, but to listen to the wisdom that is being imparted to us in the glory of your creation. And so we thank you for Kevin Bowman, for someone who listens both to Scripture and to the creation, and has devoted his life to sharing with others what the creation is speaking to us. So help us to listen well and mind his wise words as he shares with us. In Christ's name, amen. Amen. Well, if you go to Kevin Bowman at the JPL website, you're in for a treat because his page goes on and on and on with all the things that he's done. Master of several different degrees, culminating in a PhD, then moved to Southern California from the East Coast in 1997, and for the last 28 years has worked at Jet Propulsion Laboratory on the things that he's going to speak to us about. Part of the website indicates that during that time, he's received 14 different prestigious awards from NASA for his work on climate and environment, particularly trying to connect the models that are given to us by virtue of satellite imaging and convert those models into how we understand what is going on in our climate. Kevin's a Renaissance person. Not only is he a scientist, but he's also a musician, helps lead worship at La Cañada Presbyterian Church on a regular basis. He's an avid biker, just completed a 60-mile ride just 2 weeks ago. So after trying several times, Kevin, to get you, but you were being called all over the world to speak of these things, we are finally having you here at Monte Vista Grove, and we are really appreciative for your tenacity in staying with this process to land on this date, March 20th, 2025. Please welcome our speaker, Kevin Bowman.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. I know I'm looking forward to learning more about Monte Vista Grove. I know Chris Duryea, I believe, is a person who's been here for some time, and I've really enjoyed. Oh, let me see. Do I have to go and check? We reconnect. Hold on. Let me check that real quick. Let's see if I can get that going. And Marketplace. Is that good? Am I seeing something? Yes, good. All right. Great. So, yes, it's a real privilege to be here, and I want to talk about something that's of absolute importance. It's the kind of thing that we depend upon, the kind of assumptions that we move. It's like a fish going through and asking, where is the water, when it's all that it sees. But to do that, to discuss about how this world is constructed and how it's changing, I first want you to imagine a trip to Oxnard. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have been to Oxnard. There's a lot of great places to buy food. The beaches are less crowded. You've got the You've got the outlets there. Maybe you're going to go there and get some stuff for your grandkids or for yourself. It's about 60-ish miles away. Now imagine you're way back. You're going to go home. The same distance, but you're going to go a different route. And in this route, you'll start feeling a little cooler. You will start having difficulty breathing. And in the distance between your home and Oxnard, you will soon die. Why? Because you have just reached the edge of space. 60 miles. 65 miles or so. That is the distance between where we are and the edge of the atmosphere. And the question that we need to ask is, what is it that's so special about that thing that can feel refreshing on a spring day that keeps us alive? Questions often of the most importance can be asked by a child. The answers can transform your understanding of the world. One of those people is one of the most famous people you've never heard of, called Joseph de Fourier. He was a polymath, a person who did a lot of work in thermodynamics and understanding heat. All the cell phones, the music players that you've listened to, whether it was on records or whether it was on a digital phone, owe to the mathematical principles that Joseph de Fourier built. But in this time, he asked a simple question. What controls the Earth's thermostat? Why, when you go outside, why is it 70 degrees? Why isn't it 200 degrees? Why isn't it minus 200 degrees? Why is it 70 degrees? That fundamental question is based upon the relationship between the sun and the earth. But there's something missing. We know that the sun gives us heat. You can see that, you can feel it. But why aren't we as hot as the sun? To answer that question, you first have to ask your budget. We're all familiar with a budget. I don't want to know what your budget is, but you have one, and we all deal with it when, say for example, you have an account, and you have a certain amount of money that comes in. Say you've got your retirement pension, or you're still working and you're making a good deal, and you have expenses. You have your lights, you have your house, your kids are going to college, so those numbers are going up, and a lot of times they're going down. For those of you who worked in the ministry, you're sitting there and you're spending money all the way through the year, and you're waiting for that December to show up to give you that last piece of income. Because you know that in the absence, over time, if that money that comes in and the money that goes out is different, you're either going to be making money in your account or you're going to be dropping money in your account. For the earth, the currency is energy. That energy comes from the sun. But where does the energy go? That's the question. So, that energy going out, Joseph Fourier was able to say, okay, if there's a certain amount of energy coming in, there has to be a certain amount of energy coming out, otherwise we're toasting. What's going on? And the answer is, in something you might say, all of the light that you cannot see. It's a kind of energy that you can feel, but you can't see. And that's called heat. What you're looking at behind you, this beautiful image from one of our satellites from JPL, and it's measuring the heat coming off of the Earth, the thermal energy coming off of the Earth. You can see it's quite different in its distribution. Some places are cooler, some places are warmer, but in order, that is the energy that it's making its way off of the planet versus the amount of energy that's coming into the planet. So then he asked another question. All right, well, there's heat and there's sunlight coming in, so why aren't we like the moon? And any of you who were there and watched in 69, when the first man landed on the moon, he wasn't wearing, shorts and a t-shirt and going outside and sunbathing. It's cold, very cold. So why isn't the temperature when you walk outside the same as that, like that of the moon? What Joseph Fourier surmised is that somehow the atmosphere was trapping some of that heat. And he called it the greenhouse gas effect. Now, he didn't know what those greenhouse gases were. He just knew that if the energy was coming in, he just understood the energy budget. If the energy's coming in, some energy going out, something's got to be trapping it for us to have a nice, stable temperature that we all live in. The answer to what it was came later. John Tyndall, an Irishman, I believe. Terry, we appreciate that. He was a scientist during the Industrial Revolution. And what he did is he went through and he had this really complicated contraption. And he would stick in gases, which if you had coal going on in the Industrial Revolution, you could readily get some of that. And you could pipe it in front of this contraption. And what he found is that when he put in water or CO2, and he had this heat coming through, the amount of energy dropped. It's like a film that was keeping the heat from getting through the chamber. So he was able to identify something that Joseph de Fourier could not. He was able to identify those carbon dioxide that was trapping that heat. Those two pieces now make a very important point. Earth's jacket is carbon dioxide. It allows us to have energy coming in, but when the energy starts coming out, it gets trapped. Like in the way, when you put on a jacket, the amount of heat coming off your body stays within the jacket, and it keeps you warm on a cool day. Carbon dioxide does that, but it does it for the entire planet. You can see this more effectively in this diagram, where you can see light coming in, the sun's bringing in, and then it's hitting the ground. The earth is heating up from the sun. It's radiating heat, just like you might radiate heat if you get hot. And then the carbon dioxide's keeping some of that heat from escaping back out into space. It's for this reason that carbon dioxide is one of the pillars of our climate. It is one of the things that keeps us and this planet regulated. It allows us to have a stable temperature. So you might think, okay, what's happened in carbon dioxide the last 100 years or so? This is a figure, it's a graph, and it's a description of how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, starting at something called about 320 parts per million. That's the unit. And it's been going up. So I want you to sort of contextualize what this graph means, so I want you to imagine your first car that you really enjoyed. My grandfather loved cars, and I shared his joy for cars. I'll be happy to tell you about the car that I got recently afterwards. But maybe, if you're in the 50s, the thing that really revved you up was a Corvette. Beautiful Corvette. Maybe you got that Corvette, and that was the car you're like, I'm gonna get her with that Corvette. I'm gonna catch her eye with that Corvette. Or maybe you're more in the 70s, a little bit more loose. That was a Trans Am. Maybe that car was the one that you really liked. Or maybe you're even more 80s, you're sort of back to the future. So you had a DeLorean. I want you to think about the moment when you had that car that you really enjoyed and driving it around. The carbon dioxide that was emitted from that car never left the atmosphere. The carbon dioxide that you were driving in that Corvette never left the atmosphere. The one that was in the Trans Am, it didn't leave the atmosphere either. Or the one from the DeLorean didn't leave the atmosphere. So what happens? Like a bucket of water, carbon dioxide has just been getting higher and higher and higher. And it's gone from 320 parts per million back in the 60s to 420 parts per million. So I want to think about, if your blood pressure changed by that amount, would you be concerned? Think about that on a planetary scale. Now you might say, okay, well, carbon dioxide, it's been going up and down. I mean, there's natural climate variability. What about in the past? I mean, that's just 1960. Maybe it's been like that before. One way to find that is by drilling to the past. These folks, I might consider them the sort of the Green Berets of climate science, have built these ice cores. They've built, not ice cores, they've built these drill bits that can go 2 miles into the surface of snow. And this is in Antarctica. Now, over time, when you got wind, it goes over snow, and what happens is some of that wind, some of that air gets mixed in with the snow itself. And then the next year comes by, and wind kind of cuts across, and snow increases a little bit, and it grabs a little bit of that air and gets mixed into the snow. So the snow becomes a tape recorder of the atmosphere over many, many, many years. And they're quite literally drilling to the past. So by extracting that ice core and then looking at how much carbon dioxide has been in the atmosphere or in the ice core over 2 miles in length, you can begin to understand the history of carbon dioxide in our planet. So what does it tell us? What it tells us is that nobody ever has breathed as much CO2 as we have in our current day. This is 800,000 years is what this tape recorder has given us. And I want you to look at the time of the start of the human civilization, when the Babylonians, the Assyrians, many of them you've read about in the Old Testament. The lives, their triumphs, their failures, the interactions with Israel, all of this goes in this very part between 10,000 years ago. Look at 1910, where it was 300 parts per million on the eve of World War I. And now at 409 in 2018. Nobody has ever breathed this much CO2. The consequence of increasing a jacket, making it denser and thicker, means you will warm up. What you're seeing here is a temperature anomalies that we've had since 1880. So it's a departure from the average. So the average amount has been subtracted out. And so you see in 1880, it was cooler than the average over the last 100 years. And then you can see that in 1940, and in particular 1980, temperatures started going up. And they've been going up ever since. We have now reached 2 degrees Fahrenheit. We first hit that in 2023. We are altering the planet in which we live by altering one of the pillars that regulates our climate. Now, one might ask, okay, I see there's 2 degrees. Maybe there's something else. Again, climate varies. Maybe there's something else that I could attribute that to, natural variability of some type. And one way we investigate that question is sort of the way that a mechanic would investigate that question. Let's say you take an automobile. Now, with the EVs, it's not quite so simple these days, but if you consider a classic automobile, maybe you worked on back in the 40s or 60s or 70s, I certainly have had my share of having to rebuild a carburetor. Let's say your car, you go up and your car turns on and it's not working. It's running rough, it doesn't start. What is the mechanic going to do? The mechanic is going to go, he's going to take the engine, he's going to start turning on and turning off different pieces of the engine until he can isolate that part that's causing the car not to work. That's what automobile maintenance is about. We don't get to turn off the world to figure out why 2 degrees Fahrenheit's going up. We can't just turn off the oceans and turn on the lands. We can't do that. But what we can do is represent the world as best we can through very sophisticated descriptions or computer descriptions of how the world works. We can see, hey, can I represent the world as it is with oceans and lands and human beings and cars? And then I can turn those knobs on and off and see what happens to help me understand why the temperature changes. So, we're back to that same picture. You can see that it's cooler in the 19th century and it starts getting hotter. And this includes both the way different numerical calculations can do this, and it can show, you can see that that sort of yellow line, the one in the middle, it does a good job of representing the black lines, which is our observed changes in temperature. So, okay, I can figure out, I can get this very sophisticated model or numerical simulation to represent how temperatures have changed over the last 100 years. But the only way they can do it is if they increase CO2 in the atmosphere. In the absence of increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, you get this thing on the right. You see how you have the black pieces and it just doesn't go up. The temperatures don't go up unless you increase CO2. It's the only way we get there. And that is why we know both from basic physics, basic thermodynamics, from your own personal experience, if you put on a jacket, you're going to get hotter. If you put across the planet, you take something that insulates and you add more to it, it's going to insulate more, meaning the temperature is going to go up because the energy budget, the amount of energy coming in and the amount of energy going out, has to balance. Now so the world is changing, and it's changing because of the amount of carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere. But there are other elements that I want to explore a little bit. One of them is that nature is giving us a discount. One that many people would not notice. What you're seeing up here at the very top is the amount of carbon dioxide that would go into the atmosphere if you just counted up all the cars, all of the industry in the world. And the thing on the bottom is actually how much carbon dioxide we actually see. What it turns out is that the Earth is giving us a big discount of almost 50%. That means the amount of carbon dioxide that you see now is roughly half of what you would get if you just considered the cars and the industry, etc. The explanation for that, you can kind of see from this simulation. What you're looking at is carbon dioxide weather. It is how carbon dioxide is moving around the world. And you can see that it's kind of red at the top. And then over time, you'll see that the red starts turning blue. Now, what the process that's happening is literally looking at the life cycle of trees. Trees consume carbon dioxide. In the wintertime, as anyone who lives up in, maybe not less so here, but in, say, in Ohio or in the Midwest, carbon dioxide decomposes as you have trees or leaves on the ground. They break down, and they release carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That blue you're seeing right now, that is the breath of our forests sucking up carbon as they grow. The same is true for oceans, though it doesn't show up quite so easily in this picture. But the oceans take up carbon, and land takes up carbon, and the two give us a big discount. The question is, for how long? The U.S. National Climate Assessment, or NCA, calculates a number of impacts. This is something actually mandated by Congress, and all the federal agencies work together to assess climate, its impacts, and provide that information to you, the taxpayer, so you can make better decisions on how our country should be governed. What they've found through this analysis is that heat waves have increased. So the length of time that we have heat waves has increased from 20 to 60 days, from the first to the last, since 1980s to the 2010s. Snowpack in the western U.S. has dropped. This is what we need for water. Wildfires have been going up in terms of the number of fires burned. And I'll discuss that a little bit more shortly. And that sea level in the United States has gone up from 1920 by almost a factor of 4 to 10, which is why, for example, in Florida, those storms encroach much farther inland than they did before. Fire is an important part. This I'm showing you is actually a scientific publication that we had last year that was published in a very high-profile journal called Nature. The Canadian fires were unprecedented in scale. We didn't experience it so much here because we were way down in the west, but New York City was, for one day, the most polluted city in the world because it was in downwind of this fire. Using our satellite observations and the modeling tools that Terry alluded to, we calculated how much carbon was released from those fires in Canada in 2023. In California, those fire weather days have gone up by 50%, but farther into the interior of California, they've gone up as much as 200% because of the changes in temperature and water and wind that can lead to drought. And we're beginning to experience that. What you're looking at is an image of the Palisades and Eaton Canyon fire. That is the smoke coming off of that fire that changed many of our lives. And it certainly changed my life. This is a picture from Avarice, which is one of the aircraft measurements that we make. And this is Altadena, California. This is where I call home. The Eden Canyon ignition was far, far to the east. The black pieces you're seeing there, that is the remains of houses in Altadena. We fortunately live in that little sliver, a kind of sliver, a miraculous sliver that kept our house around, alive, or standing. But things in front of it and behind it are gone. The reason for this fire is because we had extremely hot, extremely dry weather, and we didn't get wind, we didn't get rain, and then we got one big whopping Santa Ana wind. Very late in the season, and it was a tinder box ready to blow. Imagine what that fire would have been like if it had moved a little bit to the east or a little bit to the west. If it had been to the west, La Cañada could have been Altadena. Move it to the east, it could have been Monrovia. It could have been Duarte. Any one of these communities could have suffered the same fate. So the question I might ask is, what do we have to do to address this question of how to change carbon or our climate, and the trajectory of that climate? And the answer in some respects is very simple. What you're looking at here is a graph that shows the accumulated carbon in the atmosphere. So if you look on the bottom, the x-axis, the bottom axis, that's how much carbon we've been emitting ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And then the vertical axis is how much temperature is going up. And the simple answer is that if you want to stop temperatures from increasing, you have to stop adding carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's like being in a pool of water, and the water's coming all the way up to the top of your nose, and then someone's dropping water into the pool, and you're asking, what do I need to do to stop from drowning? And the answer is, stop putting water into the pool. That's ultimately what we have to be able to do. The good news is that if we stop putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we will stop warming up. But how we do that is one of the biggest challenges in our century and for our generation. I want to finish by going back to, I think, a very powerful image. Again, many of you remember the day that you saw the Earth from the moon when we had the Apollo landing, Apollo 11 landing. And I want you to see the things that the astronauts saw. As you see this globe of blue and white in a sea of darkness, sitting in a space that's absolutely inhospitable to our existence. So in no small way, that picture shows us that this is our Garden of Eden. We should take care of it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Kevin. Traditionally, this is a time when people who are here in Marwick Hall get a chance to interact with you as the speaker. And I have a hunch that given what you've presented, there's going to be a lot of interesting dialogue and conversation. So who wants to get this dialogue going? Who wants to ask the first question or make the first comment? Norm?
What for you are the three most important things that could be done to reduce CO2?
So the reason why we have CO2 is deeply connected with the Industrial Revolution. It's the energy that's transformed our world over the last 150 years. The fundamental thing we have to do is decarbonize our energy system. We have dug up energy from the ground, carbon stored in geologic history for millions of years, and we pulled it up and we dumped it into the atmosphere. We have to change that process, which means we have to decarbonize through changes in using new energy systems. If you look at the sun, it's like 100,000 terawatts of energy comes into our planet. About 0.01% of that is the amount of energy that we use to drive our planet, to drive our industrial processes, to drive civilization. We don't have to get, we can get more sophisticated in how we use that energy. That energy is free. It's provided to us by the sun. So I see solar as being one of a powerful tool for doing that. I would say that ones that are worthy of investigation are the roles of nuclear in providing a stable energy platform for us. And the other parts would be using things like wind and building batteries capable of storing energy so that we can deal with the issues of intermittency related to those natural sources of energy, such as from wind and from solar. So that'd be my 3 or 4, I think what I said.
Other questions, comments? Yeah, Charles?
How has the recent shift in politics affected climate change and particularly your work and the whole scale of climate change? Could you comment on that?
Well, let's think about this in 2 parts. One is, in many respects, if I look at the previous things like the Inflation Reduction Act, the U.S. has begun to move towards reducing its fossil fuel emissions when it went from coal to oil or to natural gas. And we've seen a huge increase in the amount of renewable energy sources. And substantial interest on the part of, for example, major tech firms in changing the kind of energy. No major tech firm, if they're going to build an AI center, a data center, they're not going to build a coal-fired plant. And they're not interested in using natural gas if they can help it. They want to use other solutions. So I'd say there's a certain momentum that's going in that direction. More recently, certainly elections have consequences, and I think that the role of science is to provide you, the taxpayer, you, the citizen of this country, with the kind of information that you can use to make wise decisions. There are some who that knowledge is not convenient. But I think it's very important that however you might stand on what we should do about the world, you should know about what the world is doing. And that, to me, is an important role for science, and one that over the last couple of months has been definitely strained.
Yeah, Nancy?
I hear rumors, so this may be a rumor, but that there was some scientific investigation into taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and dumping it somewhere else. Is that a reality at all? Is anybody looking into that?
Yes. So there's, interestingly, I've been in some recent conferences, people are talking about this very question. It's called carbon capture and removal, or carbon dioxide removal. CDR is the acronym for it. And it takes on a couple different forms. One of them is whereby you have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and you're thinking like, okay, well, if it's in the atmosphere, only just take it and bury it in the ground, right? Just suck it up and drop it in. And there's some people that think along those lines. There are others that say, well, the ocean I mentioned earlier, the ocean actually takes up carbon, and it's a huge source. In fact, for long, long after all of us are gone, the fate of that carbon is going to ultimately be in the oceans. The ocean's a huge reservoir. It'll pull that carbon out, but it'll do it very slowly. There's ways of accelerating it. People have thought about different ways and conjectured about techniques that would, if you put certain types of alkalinity into the ocean, it makes it more, its ability to hold carbon is faster. The problem with all of these techniques is scale and energy. You can't, if you're going to remove carbon from the atmosphere, you can't use more energy to take it out than you would just to not emit it. Some of these, they work great if they're like in your backyard or like, in a 10-mile radius type of experiment. But we need a lot bigger thing than that to actually make a dent. So there's efforts in those areas, but from my perspective, those techniques represent the last couple percent trying to go to a net zero or decarbonized society. They're not going to be the heavy lifter. The heavy lifter is changing the fundamental way we use energy to keep our civilization running.
Some people advocate that we move to a total electrical grid and wipe out the natural gas grid. And I just wonder what research shows about that today.
So I think right now our energy systems have evolved, sometimes organically, over 150 years. When you turn on your light and you think, okay, well, I turn on my light, it works, right? This is working. And I got that power somehow from some substation over there or whatnot, and it seems like it's straightforward. But if you look at how it's done, it's a mess. Like, you can see how electrical, the utilities companies were developed in the early 1900s. They were different regions, and they talked to each other, but not in a really clean way. So decarbonizing our transportation is probably one of the lowest hanging fruit that we have. And we already have capabilities now. You can go out and get an EV at this very moment. There are now trucks which are trying to build up, which can move goods and services without having to use gasoline. As much as I love cars, and I grew up with cars, anyone who's been in a strong EV, you cannot beat the acceleration and torque from an EV. It's a thing to behold. But I just want to note that in order for that to happen, there's a lot of other stuff that kind of sits behind that you don't notice.
Question.
Sure. And I think, for each community, there's costs.
Question.
Sure. And I think, for each community, there's costs associated with going to a fully electric and, of course, maintaining, really, you want to make sure you have reliability of that energy system. From what I can, without actually going through and doing an engineering analysis of the facilities, I think you could go a long way in that direction. And I think that's the key thing, is you're moving in the right path, even if you don't completely go electric. That will eventually reduce the carbon footprint in this residence.
I have a question.
Yes.
With all your knowledge, are you personally optimistic that we can do something to save this planet? And if you are optimistic, what do you base that on?
Sure. Winston Churchill made this quip back in World War II about the United States. He said, the United States, after it's exhausted all other possibilities, will do the right thing. And I think what we're seeing in our society is this struggle between the world we want it to become and the world, people that see the world and want to change that world and move it in a positive direction, and those who look back to a world that they're familiar with. And it's going to be generational in many respects. So I'm optimistic. If you look at the next generation, the younger generation, a lot of the debates that we're having aren't a debate for them. They're not debating this issue. It's their future. It's not theoretical for them. The ingenuity that's being brought to the table to develop new sources of energy is moving at a rapid pace. There's a lot of people very interested and passionate about that. And unleashing human ingenuity to address that problem, I think, is going to go a long way towards allowing us to meet the goal of decarbonization. But there will be scars. When we looked at that temperature curve, you can think about yourself when you were born. Let me just bring us back. You can place yourself when you were born in that temperature chart. For many of you, when you were born, the temperature that you were experiencing was temperatures that we've been experiencing for years. That temperature is going up. It's not going down. It's continuing to do this. The world that we are living in, the world that we have lived, this history that we've existed, we've moved through an inflection point in history. An inflection point where the future is no longer the same as the past. That will have consequences. So I have optimism that we will do the right thing, but not necessarily at the time that we need to do it. And that there will be an impact that will take a long time to address.
Kevin, just to follow up on that, you and I had some conversation before we started this afternoon, and I told you that I have 8 grandkids between the ages of 5 and 14. Lots of us in this room have grandchildren. This really is about their future. 10, 20, 30 years out, 40 years out. What's at stake? I mean, if that graph continues to go up at the rate that you've charted it between 1960 and where we are now, what's at stake?
We've lived through a world that, in spite of a number of wars, a lot of seismic changes, has been nevertheless a stable world where you could grow food at the right time and raise it. Our grandchildren, or their grandchildren's grandchildren, and their grandchildren's grandchildren will be living in a world increasingly inhospitable to their existence. And they will live in a world that they will have to do more and work harder and to adapt in order to flourish. That curve goes up, as I showed you here. Over here. If you stop adding CO2 into the atmosphere, temperatures stop going up. But it doesn't mean they go down. It means that the damage you're doing, you've stopped doing. You've stopped wrecking the house, but the wall is still down. It's not going to come back by itself. So a lot is at stake. How much as you go up and up, it's not like just today's hotter than it was. It's kind of like if you get hot and you're outside, you start sweating, right? You're like, this is hot, and you start sweating, but you're okay. You keep on running, and it keeps on getting hotter. There's a point where your body doesn't have the ability anymore to keep you cool. And that's when you start shutting down. That's when you start having a thermal effect. In this transition, this line, as temperatures go up, there's certain things that will not be sustainable anymore. Certain places in the world where what you see outside, those beautiful trees, can't be sustained. There are places in the world right now that exceed what's called the wet bulb temperature in the summertime. That's the temperature by which you cannot cool yourself down fast enough. If you stay outside under those conditions, you will die. It's hot, you cannot live there. we don't want that to be, we don't want those places to continue to expand, and we don't want our grandkids to be in that kind of a world. That's what's at stake.
Peggy?
If you were given carte blanche by whoever is in charge at the time, both internationally, nationally, to do whatever you felt was needed to be done to make this, as Voltaire said, the best of all possible worlds. No, it wasn't Voltaire. Anyway, what would you do both on an international level and what would you tell us to do right here at Monte Vista Grove?
So the challenge is that carbon dioxide, when it goes into the atmosphere, it doesn't matter where it came from. It doesn't matter if it came from China. It doesn't matter if it comes from the United States. It's now in the bucket, which means that the problem is not simply a national problem. It's an international problem. And the challenge we have to do is to stop that bucket from going up. So if I had the resources, it would be a kind of Manhattan Project, but for unleashing other energy sources where we can change the fundamental way in which we use energy in our world. And that would be an all of the above strategy. It would be everything from being able to build more efficient and different types of ways of storing energy, such as batteries, ways of using energy that is from the sun or from natural sources. It would be using, in my opinion, things like nuclear that would be explored, or even fusion, which has been promised for as long as I've been around and yet to be realized. But if it worked, it would be a game changer. So what you have to do is throw a lot of energy or money into this and find which one sticks, which one expands. I would have a very strong, already, China has put a huge amount of effort into building a clean energy system. They're just growing so much, they're still using others. And so having strong interaction where we have commonality with other countries to build a system that is both energy efficient, that does not rely on fossil fuel, and for which can grow the economy is where I would be going. So it would be strong technological emphasis on developing new technical solutions, and it would be coordinating that with other countries so that the benefits can be accrued to all. They generate more EVs right now than anyone else in the world.
And make more fossil fuel.
And so they have a sort of an insatiable demand for coal, or energy in general. So for China, it's a matter of working and collaborating with them so that we can both move towards off those energy systems. They're not, I don't see China as being someone who's like, I'm going to do this. I have a particular passion to use coal. They use it because it's cheap, because they can get energy from it cheaply. Given the right market impulses, they'll shift away from that. India is a different story. India has now the largest population on the planet, and it is trying to grow its economy very quickly, and it's moving from to the adherence of fossil fuel. In that particular country, well, its total mass, its net economy is substantially less than China and the United States. It will grow substantially over the next decade and two. As they expand, they have a choice. How do I expand my energy system? Do I import more oil? Do I try to grab more coal? Or do I use these other systems? The faster you can reduce the cost of those energy systems, that is renewable energy systems in that market, the more palatable that becomes for someone like India. Already we have in Europe, they have something called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which by they're beginning to look at not only the importation of energy, but the way in which that energy is provided. And I think with the appropriate level of inducements, you could get India to begin to shift in its growth path towards more renewable energy sources rather than its current dirty alternatives. Just in passing, I would note, for example, Delhi has become because I make do separate work on air quality, Delhi's like become the poster child of global air pollution. You do not want to hang out in Delhi right now. They are suffering. The people are suffering. And they're beginning to recognize that that unrestrained growth has consequences for them. And they're not good. So that means there's opportunities, I think, as a consequence, to steer a different path.
Last question. Going back to your rising temperature chart from 1880 to 2020, I noted that the temperature is rising during the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering whether that's the reason. And what about modern warfare? There's 2, 3 major wars going on now in the world. How does that affect climate change? And thank you for this presentation.
Sure. So the temperature itself can lag a bit between, say you have a world war and you've got a lot of energy getting kicked in because you're building ammunition. Though it can get complicated, right? Because you're also blowing stuff up and people aren't doing anything when they're blown up. So the CO2, it's harder to see in this picture. But if you look at the fossil fuel emissions, you'll see spikes, and you'll see it in here too, where in a war, like the United States, you would have seen the energy being produced and the fossil fuels going through the roof because we're in full wartime footing. And you'd see that in other countries as well. So the activity, we call this activity, the more things you're doing. You're building stuff, you're doing more stuff, you're going to generate more emissions. The US, I think it's like, the DoD reports the amount of emissions that it has. So it also reports its CO2 emissions, as does other sectors. And it's, I want to say something like an 5 to 8% level. But a world war would have both the sort of counterbalancing effect of more activity of those who are producing armaments and less activity for those places getting blown to smithereens. And so I don't know quite clearly how that would play out. And I'm not sure for that temperature setting if it's related to something short term, like an actual emissions from World War II, or related to some secondary effects like aerosols or something else that would change the energy balance that might lead to a local change. But it's a great question.
Ron, tell us about next week and the special convocation that we'll have.
We're privileged next week to hear from Dr. Jonathan Walton, the president of Princeton Seminary. He is coming to give the first O'Grady lecture on Friday evening on theology and culture and preaching on Sunday morning at San Marino. Could we get him to come to Monte Vista Grove? He is a remarkable leader. Some of us have had the privilege of hearing him speak. He's 2 years into his new presidency. I think every one of us will enjoy this. We're aware the church is changing, which means theological education is changing. You'll want to hear him next Thursday.
Well, we are so very grateful to you, Kevin, for sharing your wisdom with us, your passion. Thank you for being someone who lives out Psalm 19, listening to what the creation is telling us and helping us ask the question, what does that mean for how we live? So we're very, very grateful for your presence. Can we show our appreciation? And Kevin has agreed to stay for dinner, so if you'd like to come and engage in some further conversation, please join us over in the rendezvous.